Welcome to Story Talks, where we discuss the practices that engage, motivate, develop, retain, and attract people to businesses. We'll give you principles and tools based on real-world stories to leverage listening and storytelling to become a better leader and management professional. Story Talks is produced by Narativ, a company that focuses on personal storytelling for business.
Welcome to Story Talks. In this podcast, myself, Jerome DeRoy, and Julianne Ryan, who's here as my co-host, we discuss ways in which we can create more engagement in our lives, especially at work. There's more people who identify as disengaged at work than there are who identify as engaged. So we come from Narativ, which is a company that focuses on engaging businesses and their audiences through the power of listening and storytelling, employing a 7-step method to do so. And it turns out, and this is why we created this podcast and started inviting guests, it turns out that there's a lot of people out there who worry about the same issue and who work to increase engagement in a variety of ways. And we really want to hear from them so that we can give you, our listeners, the benefit of their wisdom. And so today we have such a guest and really happy to have Aoife O'Brien. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Aoife is the founder of Happier at Work. She has a podcast called Happier at Work, which I had the pleasure of being on, and that's how we know each other. But Happier at Work, just to give you a little bit of an introduction, is a business with the mission to support organizations in retaining top talent. She's passionate about fit and specifically how creating the right environment can help individuals to reach their full potential and support organizations to thrive. She partners with HR and business leaders to focus on 4 pillars: engagement and belonging, leadership equity, performance and productivity, and the future of work. She's a self-professed data nerd, maybe we'll get an example of that, with a 20-plus year career in market research in the fast-moving consumer goods industry, working with clients like Coca Cola, Unilever, and Heinz to solve marketing problems using data analytics. Aoife has been featured by several national media platforms and public speaking events talking about imposter syndrome, fit, employee engagement, productivity, and remote working. Her podcast, which I've had the pleasure of being on, as I mentioned, Happier at Work, features a combination of interview-based episodes as well as solo podcasting and has 50,000 listeners in more than 50 countries.
Thank you.
She has lived and worked in Dublin, London, Perth, and Sydney, and has an MSc in Work and Organizational Behavior, a diploma in Executive and Life Coaching, and a certificate in career coaching. So welcome to the show, Aoife.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And I think always when I hear people reading my bio, I think, wow, who is that person? She sounds amazing. Not realizing that, you know, when you apply it to yourself, you're kind of like, oh.
Yeah. Well, it fits with the, it's interesting because one of the things that I think as entrepreneurs, but just also as human beings, that idea of the imposter syndrome comes up in your bio and in our conversations, and something that you address within organizations and with individuals. And so, it's interesting that it's never that far away, right? And so
Totally.
That question at a very basic level, questioning, oh, is that really? Yeah.
This is it.
Yes, exactly. But maybe, since I did give this bio an introduction, when I came onto your podcast, which is really great, and I recommend everybody to listen if you haven't already, because it's just filled with resources and interesting people. But maybe you could tell us, Aoife, a little bit about yourself and how you came to do this kind of work, that transition from that quite vast experience you had in the corporate world with these different companies that we mentioned in your bio, and then coming to this conclusion, and so much so that you even decided to do something about this issue. Could you tell us maybe a little bit about that journey?
Yeah. Really good point, actually. I love that you've gone beyond and said that you decided to actually do something about it. I'm not just thinking about it. I'm not just talking about it. I'm actually taking action and doing something. But yeah, I had a fantastic career. I loved it. As you mentioned, I worked in fast-moving consumer goods, which in the States is known as consumer packaged goods, CPG. People might be more familiar with that term. And the way I think of it is anything really that's sold in a supermarket. So anything that you can buy in a supermarket, with the exception of, DVDs and white goods, they call them, like washing machines and things like that. It's the the stuff that moves quickly off the shelves. Wonderful. I had a brilliant career. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's such an interesting area because it's so familiar. Most of us go shopping on a regular basis. We know what products we like. We know what we kind of have an understanding of the layout of a supermarket. And so analyzing that kind of data for me was really interesting.
Mm.
And I had some fantastic experiences where I loved some of the jobs that I had, and I was in other places where I loved the people that I worked with and I loved the job that I had, but I was really struggling with something, and I probably at the time couldn't really articulate it. And I ended up leaving that role. And then at a later stage, I traveled in living in all of those different areas. I actually ended up traveling quite extensively as well. So I've seen quite a good bit of the world, which is brilliant. And I love travel. Um, in my travels on the way back from Australia, which is where that job was, I was thinking, where will I go next? I could go back to London, where I had previously lived. I could go to Dublin, where I was from, or I could go to New York, which is something I've always wanted to do. So if anyone's listening in New York and has a job, but these are the kind of thoughts that were going through my head. And ultimately, I decided to return to Dublin, thinking this doesn't have to be forever.
Mm.
And I had a job there, loved it. And then I found it a little bit of a roller coaster I stayed there for 4.5 years. And I forgot to mention that the role I had in Sydney, I stayed for less than 18 months. So, they had sponsored my visa, they paid me a high salary, and I was gone. So we'll get into a little bit more detail about that, I think, in a minute. But I came back to Ireland then, and for 4.5 years, I found myself on a little bit of a roller coaster. And I just came to the stage where I thought, I've had enough of this, and I decided to leave. And that kind of in itself brought me on a journey. So I went on to do a certificate in career coaching, a diploma in executive and life coaching, and then I started the master's. And in the process of doing the master's, I was sort of brought back to everything that I love, which is data, but using data to solve problems. And the problems that I cared most about were not whether or not Mars were going to sell more Mars bars
Right.
or Unilever were going to sell more detergent. It was really about the people at work and how to solve those kind of problems that we were seeing at work.
Mm.
And that's kind of a summary of a journey that I was on, that brought me to where I am now.
Mm. Wow, fascinating. I mean, it's interesting how it really mirrors it's often the case, I find, when someone decides to do about something that they care about. There's an experience that kind of mirrors the broader problem that you're trying to address, so you got sort of this, which by all accounts might be the dream job. You go to a
Yeah.
foreign country, it's exactly what you wanted, you get paid money,
Mm,
and all of these things, and you're kind of going up that ladder, and yet something doesn't work, and you decide to leave, and so many people have gone through that, and I think especially in the last few years. I mean, I think it's throughout history, but there's a lot of attention paid currently
yeah.
to this idea of the Great Resignations, and then recently we had someone on who was telling us a little bit more. It's quite a new term about this idea of quiet quitting. And so,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
all these, which to me, comes back to something that's dear to us all here, this idea of disengagement and what to
Mm,
do about it. But it's, if I go back to my own experience, and I think, Jules, it's the same thing, there are these moments when we don't feel engaged at work, and we can either, maybe the organization helps us get through that hump or not, and but
mm,
there's lots of different kind of scenarios that can happen.
yeah.
And so it's interesting how your own experience mirrors that. I guess I'm interested also in the idea of using data to solve what I would call human problems, and how do you sort of see that, because you said it yourself, it's not data to help sell more product or look at where are
Yeah.
the gaps and how can we be more productive over here, but how do you see that, this idea of data to solve human issues, or what I'm calling human
I
issues?
suppose for me, how I started on that, I was involved on a volunteer basis in the last corporate organization that I worked in for the people analytics team. So they kind of they had maybe one or two full-time people working on people analytics, and they brought in a few volunteers to support them with analyzing the data and with looking at changes and things like that that were being made. Now, my main memory of that scenario was that we made a huge change to how we measured people on a performance rating scale. I think we went from a 4 scale to a 5 scale or something. So when we're looking at comparing, then, for example, we were looking at a specific management program that I happened to be part of as well, which was great. So I was taking part in this management program, and then also looking at, well, what data do we have to support whether or not we should run this management program again. So if we have a look at the data, but I mean, if you think of anything that can go wrong from a data perspective, there was a change in the ratings, so you couldn't really you're comparing apples with oranges. You're not really comparing like with like at all. There was a restructure that happened at the time as well, so a lot of people changed managers, they changed roles, so many different changes. So it was so difficult to really isolate, well, what is the difference, or what is the impact that this specific leadership development program is having. So that was hard in and of itself. But if you think of data more broadly, and the amount of data that any organization has on its people, so you might have different data sitting in different places. So typically, I think we think of HR data. We think of things like absences. We think of things like time to hire.
Right.
We think of things like, well, what's I'm trying to think now of some of the more HR stuff, but you can have finance, you can tie in sales data to all of that, and you can relate all of those things together and have a look at, well, if we, and I suppose for me, it's beyond just looking at the numbers. So when I've worked with a couple of organizations in relation to people analytics very specifically, and oftentimes I think what they start out wanting is just a snapshot. Let us know what's happening. Tell us what the metrics are. And they're all about the metrics. But really what you want is to understand the impact. So why are you doing this? And what do you need to do more of? So if you think of engagement data, and I know that you both are very interested in engagement. And a lot of companies doing engagement surveys at the very least every year. If not, I've heard of companies starting to do it a bit more frequently now. But if you take those numbers, what are you doing with that information? Are you just taking it as a measurement, or are you taking it as, a temperature check? And like, what are you going to do differently, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Where were you a few years ago? Because there are a lot of companies that good intentions or not look at it from a prescriptive standpoint, but they don't pause to do the anthropology and really dive into the story behind the numbers. And surveys don't always do everything. So it's such a marriage. So you're really speaking to me on a few levels, having worked at consumer product company and having worked through a lot of employee issues, and saying, you got to do it a different way to approach what we're doing. So yeah,
absolutely. 100%.
Where does the, we talk a lot about, obviously, we're about storytelling. And so we sort of try to identify the stories that represent kind of the whole, and what stories do we need to hear more of, and what are the stories that are not being told but that do need to be told, et cetera, and who should be telling them. In your line of work, looking at starting with the data and then kind of getting all the way to this, going through a journey is what I'm imagining, to get to this idea of being happier at work. And more engagement. What's the role of values in this? Because I often wonder about that, because when we get called into organizations, we often see the values on a wall somewhere, or on a nice
on an email
binder.
Signature.
Yes, on an email. Yeah, exactly. An email
Binder.
signature is, an onboarding binder, perhaps, but it sort of gets put into a drawer, and 2 years later, whoever was onboarded forgot about what those values were. Or maybe they know what they are, but they don't quite know what they mean. How does that factor?
They can spout them. They can say, oh yeah, the values are this, and this, but they hold no meaning for them whatsoever. Values are a funny thing, because, when I talk about them, I often think, like, if someone had asked me 5 years ago, what are your values? I probably would have absolutely no idea what they were talking about. They might have to probe a little bit to understand, what I'm interested in, what I hold dear in my life, and what I prioritize. But if I think of corporate values, I've worked in organizations where they've been very clear, but they've been quite disconnected with the reality of what's happening. And
Mm-hmm.
through the work that I've done in my coaching, training, and also in the research that I did as part of my dissertation for my master's in organizational behavior, what came out really strongly is the importance of values when it comes to this idea of fitting in at work and feeling like we belong, feeling like, and
Mm-hmm.
everyone, I think it's one of the fundamental needs that we have as humans is to feel like we are belonging in the place that we are, wherever that place might be, that you found other people who are your tribe, who behave in a way that you expect them to behave, who behave in a way that's aligned with how you behave as well. So that's kind of how I came about this concept of values, and it really came through strongly in the research I did for my master's. So values was really at the core of the fundamental thing that we need to get right in business, and then supported by need satisfaction at work. So making sure that people's needs are being satisfied on an individual basis in order to make sure that we feel our values are aligned. So the needs are kind of below the surface. And I think when it comes to hiring, the values piece is important. When it comes to promotions, when it comes to decision making, that's where the values are important. When it comes to things like retention, when it comes to things like, making sure that people are motivated, making sure that people are committed to the organization, that's when you need to dial up on the need satisfaction piece. And that's at an individual level.
Do you have an example of that comes to mind that you could share? Because it is an important thing where you're out of context. The company's espousing one thing and they're out of sync with what they're saying they want to happen.
Yes, yeah. If I think of a situation where I was in when I was still working in corporate, and one of the
Mm-hmm.
values that they talked about was open. And in my mind, open is things like being open to feedback,
Mm-hmm.
having an open door policy, being open-minded about things, like having an open mind about trying out new things, being more innovative. And I just found that it was quite a closed-minded organization. It was very bureaucratic as well. To get anything done was quite difficult. And for me, I find that a huge level of frustration, that on the one hand, they're saying this one
Mm-hmm.
thing, and then at one point, one of the values as well was simple. And at one point, the CEO said, well, it's not about simple, it's about simplify. So making things easier, simplifying things. So it's kind of almost a backtrack, because he realized what a bureaucratic organization this was. And if he says that things are simple and they're not, then people are going to see right through that. So it's less about being simple and more about simplifying. Yeah, so things like that. And then I suppose on the need side of things, I could probably talk all day, but kind of a top summary, we have there are some universal needs that everyone has, the need for, and that's covered in the great book Drive by Dan Pink. So autonomy, he calls them autonomy, mastery, and purpose. I think he calls it. I call it autonomy, relatedness, and competence, which is it's related back to this self-determination theory of motivation. So we have those. Everyone has those needs. But we have additional needs as well, which may be unique to us. And so I'm discovering, with time, what are my needs? So a need for self-expression, to be able to express myself, a need for recognition, so being recognized by the organization. And if I think back to the organization that I worked in previously, where I was talking about those values being sort of misaligned or not being lived within the organization, I also felt that we were kind of doing tokenism recognition, where we recognize people on a monthly basis for living the values, but it sort of felt like it wasn't, I suppose, in recognizing one person, there were other people who weren't being recognized. I think
Correct.
that's sort of my thinking on that, and me being on the leadership team, I was kind of like thinking to myself, and when's my day to be recognized, and when am I going to get recognized, you know, from a very selfish perspective. But you know,
Yeah,
and
and
I did think that,
and that's really
yeah, that there
interesting
was no
because
opportunity for me.
yeah, and I'm also thinking, not we all have different kind of ways of navigating the world, and not everyone responds necessarily to a once a month kind of recognition, sort of, like those employee of the month type things that you might see
Yeah,
in certain
that's
stores. And
exactly like it was. Yes, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
and I could imagine that some people would retreat from that and say, well, that I'm not as competitive as so and so maybe for
Yeah,
me, I'm not going to be the one trying to do that. But and yet, it doesn't mean that they don't want to be recognized. But
yeah,
because we do have all those universal needs, and to me, it's more about what's being done to empower people to
yeah,
see the value of living these values and connecting them to their own. That's the probably a little longer, a little harder work to do than sort of these punctual things where it's once a month we do this, twice a month we do that.
And it's about
yeah. That's a really
optics.
good point,
Yeah.
actually, isn't it? Yeah, it's the optics. Like, oh,
Right.
this is what we're doing, almost like a tick box exercise, isn't it? This is, are we doing any recognition? Yes, we're doing a monthly. You know, that's not to discount the initiative, because it was a great initiative, and it was
Hmm.
not something we had ever done
No, yeah,
before,
yeah.
so it was quite new for us. But at the same time, yeah, in retrospect now, I can see maybe it was a bit of a box ticking, where, oh yeah, recognition, tick, we're doing recognition, that's okay, let's move on, rather than, exactly as you said, Jerome, thinking about it the longer, the harder part of, as an individual manager, how am I recognizing the individuals on my team, how am I
Mm.
rewarding them, how am I incentivizing them, how am I motivating them.
Yeah.
And as a coach that works with individuals and organizations, how does your sort of happier at work program, and I'm sorry if that's not how it should be called, but but the programs that you create, let's say, we're talking about values here and aligning with values and
Mm,
having that sense of belonging. It sounds like the sense of belonging is probably one of the top priorities that you have when you work with people. But I'm curious, without necessarily revealing any secrets of the trade, but I'm curious about those kinds of programs that get people into a place where they do feel more engaged, more of a sense of belonging. Are there a few things that you found across the board? If that's not there, it doesn't work, and if it's there, then it works for someone. Or how does that? Maybe I'm simplifying too much now, but
well, no, for
I
me,
don't
well,
want to misrepresent.
the jury's still out on that, to see if there is something that is across the board.
Mm,
For now, the program is called the Happier at Work program. That might change in the future. As you mentioned, it starts with this idea of values, but really looking on an individual basis. Do
mm,
I know what my own core values are, which
right.
I didn't know when I worked in corporate, and I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who don't know what their own core values are. Thinking about the values of the organization, what they say they are, and whether or not those values are the lived experience of people working there. And even if an organization doesn't explicitly say that they have values, there's still a certain type of behavior that happens in that organization. There's things that are rewarded, there's things that are tolerated, there are things then that are reprimanded in some organizations as well.
Hmm.
So if you think about an organization and what kind of things get rewarded or recognized, and what kind of bad behaviors are tolerated. So are you, one thing that always springs to mind, and I'm sure we've spoken about this before, is this concept of the short-term view of, I need to answer to Wall Street, I need to meet my
Hmm.
sales numbers, and I need to bring forward money that could have come in next quarter. I need to bring that into this quarter. And you kind of, it's sort of sales and revenue at all costs. So,
Hmm.
is that the ethical thing to do? Is that aligned with integrity? And I see a lot of businesses moving more towards that idea of it being a little bit more ethical and putting people ahead of profits. And I don't know if this is, I think irony is the wrong word, but I think when you put people ahead of profits, the profits naturally follow, because people want to stay there. And what I find with the kinds of organizations that certainly don't want to work with me and who I don't want to work with are the ones who put the profits first and who say it's kind of at all costs, and people are just a number and we don't care if we lose someone because we can just replace them. They don't fully understand the cost that it brings to a business when they actually lose an individual from that business. And the research shows that it's anywhere from 30% of a person's salary up to 200% of a person's salary. So if you think of the different levels that people are at in a business and how much it actually costs to replace them, and not just that, the impact on morale as well as people leave. And that's the organization that I mentioned earlier in Australia. We called it the flamingo effect there, because one person left and then another person and then another person, because when a flamingo lifts up their leg, then the other flamingos copy the flamingo by lifting up their leg as well. So
oh my God,
yeah, it
that's
really
great
was.
metaphor.
Yes.
But you springs to mind, like every time we do one of these podcasts, like I unsuppress a memory of somebody or a situation. And one right now, because you came out of consumer package, there's a gentleman who is the president of a division, very charming, the rest of it, but he was all about the good news. All about the good news. And you cannot do product innovation and have supply chain and issues and not have things go askew. But everyone always had to repackage. So you hired all these great, innovative, hardworking people trying to engage with the line workers, the unions, the truckers to tell us what we need to do. And then it was no, bundle it in happiness and no bad news. And we had a lot of flamingos a lot of time people leave because people are like, you hired me and I'm not being seen, heard, or valued for that. So I think that's a very interesting point you made about when one leaves, others go.
Yeah, it does tend to have. I suppose it shows people that there is a life outside of this organization. And I think sometimes we get hung up on the concept. And I know certainly I've been guilty of this, of what's my next move? And you're very limited to within this organization. What's my next move? What's the next step on the ladder for me? And sometimes we limit ourselves by doing that rather than thinking of the bigger picture of me being the CEO of my own career. And if I was managing my career, how will I manage that effectively? What's the next step that makes sense for me without having a misplaced sense of loyalty to an organization? And any good organization and any good manager will be happy to support you in developing your career as a human, as a person, rather than trying to prevent you or trying to be unhappy that you have decided to leave and to spread your wings and go elsewhere. So I think when something like that happens, it shows people what's possible. It shows people that there's something else out there. And it's interesting as well, Julienne, that you say about this idea of the good news only. I carried out a survey last year about well-being at work, just a general survey among employees to figure out like what's going on out there and how are people feeling. But one of the things that came back was good news only, that the company was communicating just all of the good news. And us in the middle of a global pandemic, and they weren't addressing the issues that people were actually facing. They were trying to put a positive spin on everything, which backfires. So that's kind of a lesson in itself, I think, isn't it? So even when you're trying to bring a sense of positivity, you do need to still address those issues that are, that need addressing, and you can't sugarcoat it. You have to just face the facts and address them.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, and it's interesting to me because it's also, it sounds to me like a lot of the work that you do, Aoife, is very much, life mirroring work and vice versa. And so in other words, they're not really separate, and kind of the individual from the collective, it's understanding the individual core values and how they connect to the overall organization. And is it there or not? And if not, there's a big world out there, and let's see where you can actually find that sense of belonging, right?
This is it. And if you think of it like this, I suppose, Jerome, it's still a journey. I'm learning. You know that I'm in Tenerife at the moment. I'm working remotely from over here, and that's given me another new perspective. I think when I was in Ireland and you have the cold winter, long winter nights, it's very easy to get caught up, especially during the pandemic. I was living at home. I was living on my own. Very easy to get caught up doing excuse me, a lot of work and thinking about it. Was it work that really needed to be done, or was it busy work that was keeping me busy and made me feel like I was being productive and maybe feel like I was delivering something of value when actually I wasn't really, because I hadn't taken the time to step back and think, well, what is it that I'm really delivering here? How am I adding value? And fast forward to living in Tenerife when it's sunny outside, when there's a pool nearby, when there's an ocean nearby, it makes it kind of hard, and it makes it, you do put things into perspective, I think. And, you know, one of the questions I'm asking myself recently is, what is work? What is actually work? And, you know, that opens up a whole other can of worms in relation to the unpaid work that gets done at home as well. And I know a good friend of mine, Karen, talks about that an awful lot, about the work that goes on at home, and especially for women taking time out of their careers to care for parents, to care for children, and all of that work that gets done but doesn't get necessarily recognized.
Yeah. Well, this is a compelling time of the year, because I was at that particular consumer package company at 9/11. You know, I'm a New Yorker, so you can tell from my accent, worked in Connecticut, and there was such a disconnect the next day of, there were some parts of the organization that were acknowledging what had happened. That was a huge value shift, and the tension and the engagement was like, it was surreal. And it was a global changing and, you know, experience that people were experiencing firsthand. So it was at that time, everybody was like, yeah, I could see it and feel it in the room, saying, well, you want us to worry about these products. Did you not know what happened yesterday?
Yes.
So,
okay. Yes. Yeah. The priorities and what people are actually thinking about at this time, and
right. And that's probably the you know, for many companies, I think either lost opportunity, or some of them actually were great at seizing those opportunities in the last 2 years, of those shifting priorities that aren't just for the organization, but for everyone on earth. Probably had shifting priorities in the last couple of years. I think no one was kind of spared.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think people had more time to reflect. I think people, just this idea of seeing into each other's homes rather than being in an office, it brought a sense of like more of a personal level, I think. But people, now that they were missing that piece of, and I don't want to kind of put a blanket on it and say, oh, it's the office snacks and the foosball tables and the ping pong and stuff like that. It's beyond that. It's when you're missing that daily chat with people, or the incidental bumping into people, when you're working on your own at home and away from the office, it really puts into focus what the work actually is that you're doing, and whether or not you feel that you can relate to the work that you're doing, and whether or not you feel a great sense of purpose in what the organization is trying to achieve. And I don't know about either of you, but certainly in the last, I'd say, month or so, I've seen so many announcements on LinkedIn saying, I'm delighted to say I've found this new job. I'm delighted to say, and I don't know, is it a change in the algorithm, or I don't know, is it that there genuinely are a lot of people changing? Because for many conversations I've had, the great resignation, as we're kind of terming it globally, is it hasn't really hit Ireland, and yet I'm seeing all of these announcements about people changing roles. I think it's kind of more stark in the US, where people are, you know, there's almost kind of a cliff where people are leaving roles, and I've seen layoffs and things like that as well.
Some of it's been bizarre. Yeah, trust me. It's like how people are approaching disengaging for a company. So we will not even go there. That's a whole nother episode, another time, or offline, to talk about.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, you know, I think similar to you, Aoife, I've kind of anecdotally noticed, you know, that, and even friends, you know, and people that I know who are sort of moving seemingly, because it's not even, I mean, it's not even, you know, moving once and then, you know, 3-4 years later, there's another move. It's 2 or 3 moves in a year. I mean, it's quite amazing to see some people that I know and how things have changed. Just the ability to bounce from one place to another and to switch roles. I don't know how long that will last, or you know, but certainly from what I understand, everything that I'm seeing does point to what you've been talking about, and what we've been talking about here, you know, is the idea of my priorities are shifting. This is now more important than this. And it's, you know, if we think on an individual level, what you were just talking about, Aoife, for some organizations, it's sales and profits and that's short term. Many individuals think that way for their own lives. It's, you know, salary and that's it, and or title, you know,
that's
and whatever that status thing
that's
is that I'm looking
that's really
for.
that's
And I
really
think for
interesting.
what I'm seeing, a lot of people have started to question that priority and are looking more for a balance between, you know, it's not like they don't want to get paid anymore, but it's more like, what am I getting paid for? And how does that, you know, how does that balance out my sense of purpose? Is it there? Is it not? So I think for a lot of people, it seems to have sort of created some shift, certainly, and maybe the flamingo effect of, you know, the more you see this in newspapers, et cetera, and the more you feel it in your own organization, hey, that so-and-so did that, well, maybe I'll do it, you know. Maybe I'll try, maybe this is the time for me now to do that, even after being 10, 15 years in the same position or you know, same organization without moving too much. I think it's probably a combination of things, but I'm always sort of fascinated by how it's the, you know, it's really the individual first, and then there's a kind of response from the collective organizations and their leadership, and sort of seeing, you know, how do we do that? And to me, the challenge is really having more of a balance between those two things, where you have leadership that is more tuned to it, that's listening more, and employee and kind of understanding what are those shifting priorities, both for the employees and the employers. And because very often they're really not that different. That's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, this is it. And I think, like, oftentimes we use broad brushstrokes and say organizations, but reality under the surface of organizations, and I need to remember this myself all the time, because I often talk in generics like organizations, but really it's the people in those organizations. There's no organization, it's a collection of individual people. And, you know, again, finding that tribe, come back to what I said earlier, finding that tribe, finding that place that you belong, understanding what those values are versus your own core values, and how they align or how they misalign. And something that I'm looking into longer term, I would love to find some sort of or develop myself a technology solution that looks at values and looks at the match between values. But I think beyond that, this is something that's been kind of, you know, germinating in my head for quite some time now, is thinking about what are the deal breaker values. So if someone displays a lack of integrity or ethics, is that a deal breaker for an individual? And therefore all of these values might match here, but if there's the lack of integrity, then that's going to be something that is a real misalignment, and that person should not enter that organization if there's any sort of a unethical behavior happening, you know. But knowing that kind of thing in advance, and Jerome, what you were saying about the individual who's changing job to job, you know, what goes through my mind is, are they doing that deliberately, or have they found they've left one situation that was unhappy at work, and they've gone into another situation that is exactly the same, and another situation, and is that why they're moving? Or are they doing it very strategically to build up experience, to be able to go out on their own, or to be able to kind of reach that next step in the ladder? And I love that you used that term ladder earlier, because that's something I'm thinking an awful lot about recently as well, is, does it have to be a ladder? You know, does it have to be this ladder? Are there, you know, is it a number of years of experience? Is it the type of experiences that you've had? So lots of things going on in my head at the moment.
Yeah, so, yes, same here. And we could go on, and I'm looking at the time, and unfortunately we have to land this plane. And I do want to get to a question that we ask all of our guests, and then I also want to finish up with, you know, any being able to say where to find you and your websites and social media, but and any resources you might want to share with people, because this is also, I think it's such important work. And I was going to say so timely, but it's actually timeless. I mean, I think really wherever you are in your life at the moment and career, these are questions that are so essential to be asking oneself, and in order to kind of get to the right place. So let me ask you this. Is there a moment that has, or an experience that's shaped who you are today? And we ask this of all of our guests, as our listeners know, but we'd love to hear your answer.
Well, Well, this is why I didn't go into too much detail earlier in relation to that experience in Sydney. But most certainly,
Mm,
up to that point, I had been in jobs that I absolutely loved. I had worked in Perth for a short time on a contract, and then I was in Sydney working with people who I'd previously worked with in London, and loved the type of work that we were doing. I loved the people who worked there as well. But they made, what I found is the leadership made promises that they didn't deliver on, and they told me that I was going to be promoted to director level, and they promoted my mum has to keep reminding me of this, my male colleague to be my manager, but they didn't communicate that to me. And so I was in a meeting with him, just myself and himself one day, and he started talking about all the great things that he was going to do with my clients, and I thought, what's he talking about?
oh,
And he said, "Oh, I'm your manager." And so that was kind of a that got me thinking of what could I have done differently as an individual to better manage my career and to avoid that kind of situation. But
mm,
equally,
Oh,
as leaders, as HR, what could the organization have done differently for me to support me better in that journey,
mm,
in everything that I was going through then? And most certainly, yeah, don't make promises that you're going to deliver on, you're not going to deliver on. And I think, in retrospect, when I'm looking back, and this, at this stage, I think 10 or 11 years ago, and for me, it goes against my value of, I would call it commitment. If I say I'm going to
mm,
do something, then I will do it. Other people might call it something, they might call it integrity, they might call it honesty, or something like that. But for me, it's commitment. If I say I'm going to do something, then I will do it. And so when people tell me they're going to do something, naturally I believe them. And if they don't do what they say they're going to do, then that jars with me. And so that's, I suppose, a way of understanding that the relationship of values, and knowing that, that's great to look back in retrospect and understand that. But I suppose from a individual's perspective, if you think of situations like that, try to identify what's the cause of that, what's going on for me. Is there something jarring me? Is there something, do I feel frustrated if my needs are not being met at work, or is the behavior not reflective of how I feel people should be behaving at work?
mm,
What's really going on underneath. But
wow.
mm,
that has brought me to where I am now. It got me thinking, what should I,
Mm-hmm.
it took a little detour when I came back to Dublin, and I worked in another organization which further solidified this journey that I'm on,
Mm-hmm.
where when I went to do my master's, it became the topic of, like, these are the things that happen to me at work. And my lecturer said, well, that sounds like something to do with fit and fitting in at work, and
mm.
sense of belonging. So I became a little bit obsessed with that whole topic. And here we are today.
Wow.
Yes,
Amazing.
now they're a case study, which is the best way to
Yes.
deal with the past sometimes. But that example ticked off so many boxes of ran wrong in that room when he was sitting
Mm,
with you, as well
mm.
as everything that happened outside of the room. So,
Oh,
oh my
absolutely.
God,
Yeah, yeah,
yes.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, the value of a story like that to understand where you're coming from and how you now work and what you
Mm-hmm.
might be doing for other people. It just completely crystallizes it,
Mm.
and then of course how something like that can even be used as a kind of example, which I mean you do
Yeah.
for others, right? To sort of see, have you been
Yeah.
in a situation? Because it sort of touches the heart in such a way that oh yeah, I know that situation of being, and even though I'm a man, but it's also like just that idea of something was not communicated to me and
Yeah.
something was promised to me. There are so many
Yeah.
things that in that moment you kind of feel it
You can
as
relate
yes,
to.
yeah, and it's
Good
it's like
punch.
yes, and it does go like against your values for sure. Like that's kind
Yeah.
of how I'm feeling it. Well, it's great.
Mm.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, and it's really great. I think at some point we'll go over our episodes and maybe do a compilation of all these answers, because they're always so great. We just get a little snippet of somebody's
Yeah.
life, but it's so specific, and it's amazing to see 10 or 11 years ago that happened, right? And where you are
Yeah.
now, and how, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that connects, that fits, makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah,
So
yeah. And
yeah.
I think it was a Steve Jobs who said that you can only really connect the dots in retrospect. So at the
Right.
time when
Mm-hmm.
you're living that experience, it's very difficult.
Oh.
But when you
Mm-hmm.
look back on the experiences that you've had, and you can see how they all interrelate, you see how they connect together to get you where you are now. And even if you think about where you are now, you maybe not be able to connect the dots with where you want to go in the future. But when you're in the future, you can look back and see how all of the dots connected. So if that provides some relief to someone today, I hope it does.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And on that note, is there anything else that you would want to add in terms of, pointing people in a certain direction who may be looking for a sense of purpose or a sense of belonging, or there, we can certainly talk about your websites, but I wonder if there's anything in particular that you would like our listeners to know.
There's a couple of things. I know we haven't touched on this idea of imposter syndrome at all. We kind of mentioned it at the start, but I do have a quiz for imposter syndrome, which is, you'll find it at the impostersyndrome.ie website. If you want to remember, the impostersyndrome.ie/quiz. I do the same thing on Happier at Work. So just a kind of a short quiz to determine happiness levels in the organization. So you answer a few questions and see, well, where are you in relation to the overall levels of happiness at work? So you'll find that on my website, happieratwork.ie. The podcast you mentioned already, it's available across every platform. Happier at Work. It's quite easy. It's just what it says on the tin, I like to think. So for anyone, feel free to look me up and to search me on social media. You should find me on Happier at Work, and any of my social media links are on the website as well.
I love the fact you took a bold choice and said happy, because we use word engaged. That's very tempered, very professional, but pose if you're happy and what that means. That takes the whole conversation to a new level. So fair play to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, agreed. It's great. It's great. Very inspiring, actually, to sort of think of one's life as, I could be happier. So great.
Yeah.
Well, if our listeners want to be happier, I really encourage you to just happier, not even at work, just happier. I think Aoife makes us all happy. So, maybe, and I think you're such a great example, Aoife. I mean, right now you're in Tenerife. You've made that shift. You've clearly, you're putting into action the principles that you tell your clients to live by, even though I don't know the details of those principles or process, but when I see you in the couple of conversations I've had, it's clear that you're kind of walking that talk. So so
send a postcard back to Australia.
That's right.
With a few URLs. Thinking of you.
That's right. I love that.
Thanks for everything.
That's great. That's great. Well, I'll just say a few words to close us out. But really, this has been just a pleasure and so much great information. There's just not enough time to go through this. But if you want to learn more about Aoife's work, she mentioned Happier at Work, the podcast, and there's happieratwork.ie, and there's the imposter syndrome. So that's impostersyndrome.ie, imposter with an E for you Americans. And then you can also take a quiz there, and that's free, of course, and you'll get some information there. And then Aoife mentioned her social media, Instagram and YouTube. And as for us at Narativ, we here, and we really thank everyone for listening. And as always, please visit our website, narativ.com, narativ.com, because there'll be lots of information on previous podcast episodes. We've got a blog that's quite active, a lot of articles concerning these particular topics as well, and resources. And most importantly, you'll find information on how you can find, craft, and present the stories that'll engage your audiences and yourself like nothing else has before.
Make a difference.
That's right. We are ready to listen to you. So again, thank you, Aoife O'Brien, and thanks, Julienne, for being my co-host, and really look forward to the next one. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
For more information on the narrative listening and storytelling method and how it can help your business, go to narativ.com.